Good evening, everybody. Appropriate that as I film this, preparations for the 4th of July holiday are well in tow. I can hear fireworks going off in the background. And although it seems to have been superseded by the Supreme Court case in Roe v. Wade, essentially overturning Roe v. Wade, and I don't want to discount how momentous that decision is. A few days before that, while I was at PorcFest, the Supreme Court also basically uh, overthrew a very restrictive concealed carry law in New York State. And this is the end of a very, very long chain of history. Not the end, but it's a milestone in a very, very long chain of history and basically a revolution in gun rights in this country, a very powerful and positive revolution in gun rights in the United States. And for those of you who don't know, I started my channel as a gun rights channel. I think the first 20 or 30 videos are about gun rights. I'm not personally a huge gun person. Obviously, I own guns. I've been owning guns for close to 15, 20 years at this point, but I'm not a shooter. I'm not a hunter. I've trained with them just a little bit enough to know what I'm doing, but not, any expert. It's an expensive habit after all. But that was an issue that I thought went to the very pith of political philosophy. To me, it was one of the most crystallizing, most important issues in all of deontology. It just strikes to the heart of who owns you, who has autonomy, who has sovereignty, right? And the utilitarian consequences of the questions are no less momentous. And so honestly, it was the very first issue that not only that I made videos about, but that I really examined in any detail, going all the way back, even well before I was an anarchist. I was in high school when Columbine happened, and that was one of the first big political storms, debates that I saw, especially in the 2000 election between Al Gore and George Bush, an election that kind of has gone down in history as a stolen election, right? So for those who say that elections can't be stolen, there's a substantial part of the population who believes that election was stolen, perhaps correctly. But one of the huge issues, and one of the issues that was believed to have lost the election for Al Gore, other than the Florida Supreme Court, was his outspoken support of gun control. And the NRA had gone and found all these videos of what happened in the UK and Australia just a few years before. I think those two countries in 96 and 97 had passed substantial gun control. They didn't outright ban and confiscate all guns, not quite, but they massively increased their regulations and their restrictions. And they did indeed confiscate a huge number of firearms and then destroyed them. And there's videos of them destroying them. I don't know if these videos were taken as propaganda to be shown at the success, but those videos were seen in the United States and they were spread by the NRA. And tens of millions of gun owners in the United States got the message. And there's been a revolution in the way Americans think about gun rights. For a long part of our history, we basically took them for granted. It was just an established fact that guns were widely available, freely available, that there was a massive gun industry, that there was easy access to everyone of every type, and it was just seen as completely as American as apple pie. There was obviously a lot of frontier history there. The ratio of the society that was a frontier society is easy to exaggerate. Even at the time of the American Revolution, only a minority of people truly lived on the frontier. If you lived in Philadelphia or New York or Connecticut or most of New England, you didn't live on the frontier. Only a few people did. But the rights accorded to them were accorded to everyone. And by the late 19th century, of course, there were only a small number of people lived on any kind of frontier, and the frontier rapidly closed and became something that wasn't necessarily so violent that you would need the best guns available. But the law was there. The Second Amendment was there. The ideology was there. The founders had talked about this quite a lot. And like several issues, they dealt with this in very philosophical, generic terms that are applicable not just in the late 18th century circumstances that they found. This is quite unique, actually. If there are things to be said about the form of the U.S. government, what's so incredibly unusual about it, and I don't say this as a hagiography to say it's the best government or perfect or anything like that. I'm quite a critic of the Constitution by and large, and of many of the ideas and personalities of the founders, but they seem to really, in many instances, grapple with serious questions, and these found they were manifest in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and because of the circumstances of being on this continent and not really having major continental rivals that could really threaten the state or the society in any meaningful way, those ideas were able to kind of fully mature and blossom in a way that was very difficult. I've read that the Dutch Republic at one point, early in the 19th century, adopted something very close to the Second Amendment, and this idea that we're going to have an armed populace, and this is going to defend the state. But Holland is this very small, indefensible country for the most part. You can flood some of the rivers, and that's about it. It's literally the Low Countries. And when the Napoleonic armies swept in, it doesn't matter if you had a really good militia or not. Not that in that particular case they had even had time to develop one or develop a gun culture. Even if they had, just the circumstances probably wouldn't have allowed that to really blossom. But it did here. And then throughout the 20th century, in the middle and the late 20th century, you started to have a lot of municipalities start to restrict gun rights. The frontier was closed. The cities were urban. People were urbanizing. Even things like hunting became relatively rare. My dad was a bow hunter, and it was easy for me to imagine that hunting was something that was a generation to generation had always done, but that really isn't true. After the first pioneers had settled, they exhausted the game supplies, and by the late 19th century, depending on where you lived, hunting was no longer that common. So my grandfather did not hunt, his father did not hunt, his father did not hunt. And so there was this massive change in the culture. People weren't gun owners in huge numbers like they had been earlier, and municipalities got away with a great deal. And the regulatory state, at the state level, at the city level, and slowly but gradually at the federal level, started to chip away at people's Second Amendment rights. And initially there wasn't much backlash. There wasn't much organization against it. There wasn't a hue or cry. And a lot was done. And then at some point in the 90s, I suppose, there became an awakening of consciousness. People became aware that the frog was boiling. And there's now grown numerous gun rights organizations. The NRA is the most famous, and deservedly so. It's the largest, it has the most overt political power, and it has a lot of political power. It's unique political power because it has members that are Democrats that live in blue states and Republicans. It doesn't have a ton of money. It has a ton of voters. It's been kind of laughable to see how the gun control advocates out there pretend like the NRA just has a bottomless supply of money and that the gun industry supports them so that they support the gun industry. It's a joke. But what really does make them powerful is that there's millions and millions of Americans who support gun rights through the NRA. But it should be remembered there are many, many more gun rights organizations. And by and large, the NRA is the most moderate. In fact, many gun owners think that they're kind of sellouts in many important respects. So the next largest gun organization, the Gun Owners of America, their stance is that there should be absolutely zero gun laws or restrictions of any kind at any level. Full stop, period. That's it. And that people should be as heavily armed as possible, and explicitly the reason for this is to potentially resist tyranny. Yes, you can hunt. Yes, you can target shoot. Yes, you can collect. Yes, you can sport shoot. Yes, it can be a fun hobby. And yes, you can use them in self-defense from common criminals. Those are all great things, but they're just ancillary. They're just ancillary benefits. The main reason is to defend yourself from tyranny, and not from Canada invading, not from Russia, not from Red Dawn, but from the U.S. government. So, in addition, I just mentioned the Gun Owners of America because it's the second largest, but there have been a whole bunch of legal foundations, a bunch of lawyers got organized and have been bringing suit and suit after suit after suit after suit. And the day after the Supreme Court made this ruling, there have been and there will be dozens, if not hundreds, of lawsuits filed in every state that has restrictive laws, in every city that has restrictive laws. And we're going to see, I think, a massive shift. Okay, some of these states are going to resist. They've been resisting, but they're going against the tide. And what's so ironic about this issue is those who want to have a bigger state, who want to have the progressive nanny state, the welfare state, the industrial, the military industrial state, the empire, they see it as federal supremacy is the key to everything. And they use federal supremacy to force the entire country to be a certain way. And that's really sad. That goes against federalism. That's not the system that, well, I think that we're supposed to have, or at least was envisioned to have. It's certainly not a system that anyone should want. But that's a two-edged sword, because when push comes to shove, a much larger portion of the country, and I don't just mean electorally, but in terms of population, supports gun rights. I hear so many times in the media when this law was struck down in New York. So for some details, New York, every state allows you to own guns at home. Now some states restrict what kind of guns you buy. Some states require you to get a license to own a gun or particular types of guns. When I lived in Michigan, you could own a rifle or a shotgun, no questions asked, but they wanted you to get a license or at least a registration for a handgun. Some states require you to register all guns. Some states require you to register no guns. And then there were additional rules about carrying guns. And up by the mid-century, basically all the states had restricted, at the very least, concealed carry. Now there's two types of carry, open carry and concealed carry. These are philosophically different because in the 19th century it was felt that concealed carry was somehow more aggressive than open carry. If you were open carrying a gun, that showed that you didn't have any ill intent, that you were being forthright. You're saying, look, I've got a gun. If you were trying to commit a crime, you wouldn't want to advertise that. And so it seems counterintuitive to a lot of people, but in many states and many cities, open carry was never regulated or never banned, but concealed carry was. And concealed carry by the middle of the 20th century was heavily, heavily regulated. In fact, it wasn't really allowed in any state except for Vermont. There were some exceptions if you were very, very wealthy, if you were an ex-cop. There seemed to have been laws that were made for them, say if you were a judge or an ex-police officer or a famous celebrity or somebody who was at very, very high risk. There sometimes were provisions that somebody like that could get a license. But not a normal person. Again, with one exception, Vermont, which just never saw any need to pass any state gun laws until relatively recently. And then in the late 80s, mid-80s, late 80s, into the early 90s, there was a massive, massive crime wave that affected many states, and it affected Florida. And very similar to what happened in Uvalde, it was evident that the police can't protect you. They're not obligated to. I'm sure all of my subscribers know they're not obligated to protect you, but they can't. Even if they were obligated, they can't do it. And there was a very long fight, but eventually Florida became the first state to become a shall issue state, which is to say they could set requirements to who could conceal carry, but if you met those requirements, the issuing municipality, usually a county or a city, must give you a concealed carry permit. Right now, there was many accusations at the time this would lead to blood in the streets. People would get in car accidents and then kill everyone around them. People would get in fights in stadiums. People would get drunk at the bar and whip out their gun and just kill everyone in sight. Now, those fears are maybe hypothetically plausible. except in real life, anyone who did that would know that they would be guilty of murder and they'd be facing serious charges. And so that's going to dissuade almost everyone from ever doing that. Not to say that there aren't counterexamples, but they're statistically insignificant. And so there was a lot in the media and a lot of people decrying Florida loosening up the laws and saying this would lead to blood in the streets. And it didn't. Crime went down. Now, there has been a big, rich academic debate as to whether the allowing of concealed carry caused crime to go down. So if you read people like John Lott, they offer, good empirical evidence that that's the case. A compelling argument, to say the least, that allowing people to concealed carry does reduce crime. I'm not personally convinced that's the case. All right. It's very difficult to prove something like that. It seems plausible. I don't know if the empirical evidence will ever prove something like that. But the contrary, the concealed carry causes crime to go up, is clearly wrong, because crime went down in these states. Now, there were trends of crime going down everywhere, just like Australia saw its crime going down 10 years before they instituted their bans, right? Everyone likes to talk about, look, crime went down. Look at this chart that starts in 1997 when the ban begins and shows violent crime going down, murder rates going down in Australia. Oh my gosh, the ban made it go down. Yes, but if you just expand the scale to go back to the 1980, you'll see that violent crime in Australia peaked in 1988 and began a precipitous decline thereafter, and it was only 8 to 10 years later that they passed the law. And I don't care how good you think a gun control law is, it can't time travel and make crime go down years before it was passed. And it's just not true. Obviously, something else was making the crime go down. And I'd have to say that it's likely the case here. It's some combination of factors. People have debated what they could be. The trendy Freakonomics argument was that it was abortion, because a disproportionate number of those who were aborted would have been low income, high probability of becoming criminals. Don't know if that's true. I don't think we actually have a definitive answer to this question, but it's not that hard to say that concealed carry did not make crime go up. And what you started to see happen is that it is state after state after state started passing what's so-called shall issue, right? You can have a permit, you need a permit, but anyone who meets the requirements is entitled to get one. And every time this was done, there would be calls that there would be blood in the street, but the countervailing narrative was just too strong. You could point to the other states where it had happened and where crime had not gone up and say, it didn't happen there, why should it happen here? And I remember this in Michigan when it happened. People said that there would be killing everywhere, that a drunk person wandering into your property could now be shot or killed. Car accidents would escalate into homicides on a regular basis, and the law was passed, and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of concealed carry permits were issued, and crime went down. Again, I'm not saying that it was causal. It could have been, but I'm not saying that. But it clearly didn't cause crime to go up, because crime did not go up. Homicides went down. And at some point, it becomes very difficult to maintain the illusion that restricting this is in any way protecting anyone. To make a more extreme but less contentious issue, living here in New England, living here in New Hampshire, just to the south is the heart of progressive Yankeedom, Massachusetts. And Massachusetts, in its infinite progressive wisdom, has remained the only state in the country to ban sparklers. It's 4th of July is coming up. How apropos. If you don't know what a sparkler is, it's a tiny metal stick that burns and makes sparks. I remember playing with them when I was 5, even before I was 5. They do burn very hot. You can get burned from them. They can start fires, absolutely true. But the risk is very low, and they're legal in 49 states. They're not legal in Massachusetts. And the fire marshals and the powers that be in Massachusetts who deign to speak on it say that they just are an added risk and people shouldn't be allowed to have them. And the obvious counterpoint is, and yet they have them in Connecticut and New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine and even New York and California and every state other than Massachusetts. So if they can live with it, why can't we? Well, the same is true with concealed carry. And it spread and it spread and it spread. And eventually, the few states that continued to resist, and the last state to resist any issuance whatsoever was Illinois. Illinois did not allow open carry. Illinois did not allow concealed carry. And there were organized events to get it passed there for years and years, and it was defeated. I remember reading articles, listening to interviews of, the gun owners of Illinois, the NRA Illinois, and there's many, many gun owners in Illinois. There's lots of hunters in southern Illinois. It's a big state. Just like California has 10 million gun owners, right? Illinois has a lot of gun owners. But the power of Chicago was too much, and they couldn't get anything passed. And then you had the DC versus Heller, you had the McDonald case, and the Supreme Court basically said, I think in 2008, that you had to allow citizens to carry. You could regulate how, you could have restrictions, you could have licensing requirements, but you had to have a process. And actually, in the case of Illinois, this was quite funny. The court ordered this, and they said that they had to do it by a certain date. Otherwise, their regulations would just become null and void. They did not get their act together soon enough. The appointed date came, and on that day, all of Illinois' restrictions on concealed carry were abolished, meaning that there were suddenly no laws governing this concealed carry in Illinois. Numerous sheriffs in the southern part of the state just announced that we're no longer enforced because there is no law. Of course, this gave the state legislature the necessary incentive to come up with something, and they made it as restrictive as possible. Now, starting in, I believe, 2008, right around when I was finishing college, there started to be another wave. Not shall issue states, not states that said, if you meet the requirements, you must be given a permit, as opposed to may issue or discretionary issue states, right? A discretionary issue state says there's a permitting process, but the local authorities, typically, usually the sheriff, have discretion. So you can apply and they can say, yes, you filled out all the paperwork, but we're still not going to give you a license. You started to get what was initially called Vermont carry, but very quickly became known as constitutional carry. And what is constitutional carry? That means that the Second Amendment is your permit. You don't need to get a license. It's not a privilege. It's a right. Now, again, Vermont was always this way. Vermont is still this way. Vermont probably had among the lowest homicide rates of anywhere in the world. Rural area, and they just didn't get around to passing any gun laws until very recently, in the last few years. I believe the first state to abolish all permitting other than Vermont was Wyoming, and then Alaska, and then Tennessee, and now Maine, New Hampshire. And let me go look at a list now, I believe. Yeah, let's see. Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, West Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, South Dakota, North Dakota with an asterisk. It's only for residents but not non-residents. Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, Arizona, and Alaska. Okay, so this went from one state 15 years ago to however many that is, 18, something like that. A huge increase. These are states where anyone who's not prohibited, so if you're not a felon, you can concealed or open carry typically without a license. You can just do it. You don't need to ask for permission. You can just do it. And this has been quite a revolution. This is not, oh, yeah, sure, Wyoming, Alaska, Idaho, Montana. I get it. Sure, fine. But we've got the northern half of New England. We've got almost all the Midwest. We have most of the South, most of the West. Texas has a big, but Texas is relatively new to this, by the way. We've got Georgia and Atlanta. We have Ohio. That's Cleveland. That's Columbus. Indianapolis. St. Louis. Right? And just to go over the current shall issue states. So these are states where if you want a permit, they have to give it to you. Alabama, Alaska, Colorado, Georgia, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Minnesota, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Utah, Virginia. Those have slight discretion, and then you've got states that there's no discretion at all. If you meet the requirements, they have to give you the permit. Florida, Louisiana, Michigan, Nebraska, Nevada, New Mexico, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Washington, Wisconsin. Okay. But there's been a couple holdouts. California, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey. So those are states that are still discretionary issue or may issue. These are states that say we have the right to refuse. And when this last law, this last case, I was watching a news report from the Bay Area in California. They interviewed the sheriff of whatever Bay County, whatever the county is where San Francisco is, a very populated county, no doubt. And a county with a huge homelessness, crime problem, drug problem. And they said that they have never issued a concealed carry permit. Never. 0 permits issued. 0. It's a right or it's not. Okay? It's in the Second Amendment. It's the Bill of Rights. If there's federal supremacy, it's a right, and you can't do that. Right, so after Heller, after McDonald, I think there was a feeling that, okay, they've got to do this. And many states just buckled down, doubled down, said we're going to make this as hard as possible. There are going to be so many, we're going to have one employee who goes through the applications, and they're only going to work for 10 minutes a week, right? And there's going to be 25 pages of paperwork per person. And if you get one punctuation wrong, out. Right? And so people brought suit. And eventually the Supreme Court, listen now, the Supreme Court is very fallible. They're appointed because of their political connections. Obama's appointing people on his staff, but there's nothing new. Even back to the 19th century, you don't find the judge who has the greatest jurisprudence and say you should be on the Supreme Court. You find somebody who will advance your ideology. Some of them are better than others, obviously. Some of them are qualified. Some of them, it's questionable. And they've gotten stuff wrong. But if you believe in federal supremacy, if you believe that things like Brown versus Board of Education or the Civil Rights Act or Roe v. Wade, for instance, if you believe those are legitimate because the Supreme Court said so, well, the Supreme Court says that you have to do basically shall issue. You can't play these games. You can't make it impossible. And the right to keep and bear arms doesn't mean you can just have a gun at home. Sure, you can have a gun at home. But I heard this at PorcFest, and I never quite thought of it in this way. It doesn't say the right to keep and keep arms. That doesn't make any sense. To keep and bear, those are two different things. Otherwise, it's nonsensical to keep and keep. Well, what does bear mean? Well, it has a couple different meanings. It could mean to carry, to display. Years ago at PorcFest, I actually talked to a former podcaster by the name of Bad Quaker. Very fascinating guy, good guy. And Bad Quaker said that you bring your guns to bear to point in the direction of something. So you don't just have a right to have a gun in the sock drawer, secret to everyone, in your home. You have a right to bear them. That means to carry them. That means to use them when justified. It means to point them. It means to threaten the government with them when that's what's necessary. Now, I don't know that the Supreme Court has gone that far, but as Thomas said in his majority opinion, it's not a secondary right. You don't need a permit to speak. You don't need to get a license if you don't want to be searched or to avoid torture, right? Those are just rights that you have. The Constitution says that you have them without the Constitution even being written. They're just acknowledging something that you already have. This is quite a radical idea. If you ever listen to Amy Tan talk about that, when she was told that someone out there thought that she had rights, even though she lived in the People's Republic of China, and that there was a communist dictator by the name of Mao Zedong when she grew up, that she just had rights, and maybe the government didn't recognize them, and maybe she wasn't practicing or getting to exercise them, but she has them nonetheless. And that is what the Constitution says. That's what the Declaration of Independence says. That's what the Bill of Rights says. But those are just pieces of paper at the end of the day, right? It would be wonderful, and I've used this metaphor before if you've been a subscriber for a long time. It's not like if someone violates your rights, the Constitution in its case, in the Smithsonian or wherever it's held, rolls up and flies through the air and goes into the hand of Ron Paul, and he transforms into a superhero and enforces your rights. That's not how it works. But how it does work is that there's tens, if not hundreds of millions of people out there who believe they have a right to self-defense. They have the right to own a gun. And that's the problem. That's the big problem that the gun control people have. And again, I heard so many news reporters say this terrible decision, it's forcing 80 million Americans to change their laws, right? The shall issue discretionary issue states, mostly on the coasts, especially California and New York, and a few others, Hawaii, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware. They're being forced. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but the population of the country is 330 million. So you subtract 80 million, you get 250. So there's 250 million more Americans who do have the right to self-defense. They have the right to own a gun. They have the right to carry a gun. Right? Your right to self-defense is not restricted to just your house. It's your life, even if you're out on the street, even if you're at the store, if you're at work, wherever you may be. And this is the issue. I mean, it's funny because when it comes to Roe v. Wade, they think that the court should just force everybody to do something, right? And they're terrified that it gives them an option to ban abortion. But when it comes to guns, they want every state to be able to do whatever it wants. Make up your fucking minds. So this is going to continue to be litigated. The discretionary issue states are going to kick and fight and scream, but they don't have the numbers. They don't have the numbers in Congress. They don't have the numbers of people, period. Right? And there's federal regulators, the ATF deserves a whole video of itself. They have been trying to do closet registration, closet confiscation for years. They're still trying to do it. They've changed some of the rules to try and basically make a backdoor registration of everything. It's not going to fucking happen. It's not negotiable. It's not going to happen. Right? This is just one issue that it's too big to fail. Too many people believe in them. Too many people practice them. And it's growing. This whole stuff, all these riots, all these people saying, all these liberals who say they're terrified of Trump. Okay, that's stupid. But if it makes a bunch of liberals go out and buy guns, then I'll see that as a pretty nice silver lining. Right? None of the gun rights organizations are the white supremacists that the coastal elites imagine. They want black people to have guns. They want Latino people to have guns. The more, the merrier. And they have outreach into those communities, and it's spreading. So, yeah. So this is huge. This is huge. It makes no sense that, they'll say, but we're a big urban center. Yeah, there's urban centers in Texas and in Michigan and in Wisconsin and Ohio. There's cities in those places. They're just as populated as anywhere in New York per capita. Some of those places have way worse crime than New York does. People can carry there. People have been able to carry in all those states for decades now in some cases. And you'd think the same thing that happened with discretionary issue or shall issue has happened now with concealed carry or constitutional carry. Oh no, we can never do that if we don't allow licenses. And it's been difficult with that because a lot of businesses, a lot of states, when they went to mandatory issue or shall issue, a lot of times they had a requirement that you take a class. And so then you'd get these entrepreneurs who would teach people how to shoot guns to pass the class. I took a class like that back when I was in Michigan. I didn't get the license, but I took the class just as like an introductory to gun safety and whatnot. And, a lot of those instructors will argue against constitutional carry because that's their business, right? It's mandatory that you have to take the class, so that's how they make their money. And so it's kind of hard to overcome when guys like that will say, hey, no, you don't want to go to constitutional carry because you got to have people take a class, right? You have to have people take my class, right? But cat is out of the bag, man. This is now spread. And you can just point to all those states. Oh, constitutional carry is so horrible, but yet it's okay in Vermont, in New Hampshire, and Maine. Crime's not bad there. Utah, no. Illinois, or it's not Illinois. South Dakota, Wyoming, they having a crime spree because they have constitutional carry. I think Wyoming passed it in 2008. Okay, so when's the tidal wave going to happen? When's the doom and gloom? North Dakota, same thing. Iowa, right? What are the states? Where are the states that have the worst crime? Illinois, California, New York, right? Well, they don't have constitutional carry yet. I love to say that's where it's going to go. These states and municipalities are going to fight. The makeup of the Supreme Court is going to change, maybe for the better, maybe for the worse, depending on the topic, right? But if it's going to be a battle, then the gun rights people, the gun control people do not have the numbers. And the gun rights people, the gun owners, they have way more, and they're way more. I had one person say, a lot of gun control people, their advocacy for gun control is an inch deep. They have their other issues, universal health care, the environment, nowadays, the race realism or the critical race theory, all that kind of stuff. And yes, thrown in there in the basket is gun control. Like just a little bit. But there's tens of millions of people who are passionate about their gun rights. They exercise them, they think about them, it animates them. When I was at PorcFest this year, and I mentioned him in my PorcFest recap, there was a kid, just 18, walking around with a semi-automatic battle rifle. And he carried it with him the entire time. He says he trains every week that he can hit a group on a paper plate at 800 yards with iron sights. And he lives in New York, in the state, not in the city. There's millions, tens of millions of people like him to some degree or another. It's not happening. They vote, they meme, they click. And they're not going to let this happen. And who's going to take them? Right? You think the New York people and the California people who really can't even do this in their own states. They tried to do a ban in Connecticut of AR-15s after Newtown. And they passed the law, and there was 90 to 95% noncompliance in Connecticut. Just a bunch of South New England Yankees. Total urbanites for the most part. And they didn't comply. You think that's going to happen in Texas? You think that's going to happen in Montana? You think that's going to happen in Maine? It's not even going to happen in Vermont. And, it's been said that Clarence Thomas has been berating the court for years, saying that they've been avoiding gun control cases. Basically, that they understand that any fair reading of Heller or McDonald is going to overturn these bans and these restrictions, and they don't want to do that. It's funny, they don't want to rock the boat if it's, stopping regulations. They don't mind rocking the boat if it's to, help the government, right? John Roberts was happy to legalize Obamacare, right, by saying it's a tax, even though it originated in the Senate. So it has to, if it's a tax, it has to, whatever. What a travesty, and he just said, I don't want to rock the boat. And they didn't want to rock the boat on this. They want to piss off New York City. They want to piss off California. Because they want federal supremacy or not. Is it a right or is it not? Like, a right means something. at least intellectually, maybe not in the real sense. Again, you can't get out an electron microscope and find a right particle. It's not there, right? Just like you can't find a right or wrong particle either. But conceptually, it's the whole basis of the state, of this state in particular. It's the whole reason it's justified, right? And you have all these states now that have said, look, we joined the Union on the understanding of the Bill of Rights, including the Second Amendment, maybe especially including the Second Amendment. So if that's not a right and we're talking about de facto getting rid of it, then the contract is null and void. Now, doesn't mean that secession is going to happen. Doesn't mean that there's going to be a civil war. I hope to God there's not. But that's the level that you're going against. That's what you're up against. And if you live in a big city, if you live in New York, maybe it's easy for you not to realize that. And then in your mind, if all guns are killing machines that show up once every couple news cycles to kill a bunch of kids in Uvalde, if that's your understanding of what they are, then I can understand why you'd be so delusional on this. But the very examples that you think, and I know it's not none of you watching, but if you're out there and you believe that a mass shooting where the police completely fail, where the mass shooters ultimately kill themselves or walk away or get stopped by somebody else, are evidence that we need to turn in our guns, you're dead wrong. And if it persuades you, it doesn't persuade the whatever 250 million people who don't live in your big cities, right? They don't want to live in your big cities. So, yeah, the Supreme Court is full of shit. They're not reliable, but they're building on a stronger bedrock here, right? They're building on a really strong bedrock here. And we see it again. I'm very sad for the Canadians who just had basically their handgun rights taken away, which that won't have any impact on crime in Canada. None. It will have no impact on crime in the United States. There'll still be shootings in the United States. And if Trudeau's the prime minister, he'll come for more. But in a way, I'm glad, because everybody here who cares saw that too. And they know what can happen. They saw what happened in Australia, and they hear people like Barack Obama say, we want Australia-style gun control here. Message heard loud and clear. So I'm not going to give a fucking inch. There is no compromise. What did I hear today? Today's compromise is tomorrow's loophole. Right? So when they passed the Nix background check back in 94, the Brady bill, they said that anytime someone buys a gun from a FFL, federally licensed dealer, anytime, that dealer will do a background check. But they said, if you're two people within a state, private persons, and they're not licensed dealers, they're just private individuals, well, the federal government has that's not interstate commerce, that's intrastate commerce. Now, again, the Supreme Court has interpreted interstate commerce in the most ridiculous way, right? Oh, if you sell wheat, if you don't even sell wheat, if you feed your hogs produce from your own farm, it changes the price of wheat. Therefore, you can be regulated. Yeah, that's after FDR promised to pack the Supreme Court, something that people still talk about today. Alexander Ocasio-Cortez citing that as a wonderful thing. Of course, you'd also probably advocate concentration camps for political enemies, just like FDR did. But it's not going to happen. Like, there's just way too many people. And they look at Canada and they look at the UK and they look at Australia and say, it's not going to happen here. We see the videos. We know what the way that they talk about it, the way gun control people talk about it, it makes no sense to stop with AR-15s or 50 cals, which have never been used in a crime in the United States, not once. Literally never. They'll say that the Branch Davidians had them but didn't use them. Okay, so we're going back 30 years. And they didn't even use them. They may not have killed anyone. The 4 ATF agents who died in a publicity stunt may have been killed by other ATF agents. At least 2 of them were. Maybe all 4. they're not going to be satisfied, and it is too obvious. No more guns. Guns are bad. Guns kill. Okay, we hear you. We hear you, and there's YouTube, and we can watch it over and over and over again. And we can see what they do in these other countries. Not happening here. Okay? You want there to be 1 million Kyle Rittenhouses, and that's another good rejoinder. You know, people say that there are events that wake up a lot of people, and they'll say Waco it was, and it was for me. Waco was one for me. Some people will say Clarence Thomas. Some people will say the Iraq War, the first one. So Joe Sobran, underrated libertarian since deceased, you know, he saw the first Iraq War and said, this is absolute bullshit. This is insane. And it woke him up. Kyle Rittenhouse woke up a lot of people. The riots woke up a lot of people. Uvalde's going to wake up a lot of people. And it kind of only goes one way on this, right? The people who become gun owners, who start to realize that the police are not there to protect them, that the government can't be trusted, they don't go back. You know, they don't become docile, placated statists. Now, some people will never break that, right? Some people will never become awake in that way. But once they do, they don't go back. And so this is a battle that I think that we've been winning. And there's going to be more victories. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to get everything we want. We're not going to have constitutional carry everywhere, at least anytime soon. Although the logic of the court would seem to justify that. And Thomas has given much stricter rules on what can and cannot be considered gun control legally. So we're going to see a slew of laws. It's already happened, and there's more lined up where that happens after that. From California to New York, Hawaii, New Jersey, they're coming. They're coming, and they mean business. And there's not enough Carolyn McCarthy's and Dianne Feinsteins out there to stop them. There's just not. There's a couple Congress people, a couple senators, Chuck Schumer, Dianne Feinstein, you know, she said famously back in the 90s, if she could vote, turn them all in, she would. You can't say that in most of the states. Joe Manchin can't say that in West Virginia. He can be a Democrat. You can be a Klan member and a Democrat in West Virginia. That's okay. You can't cross the NRA. I had a congressman in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan he voted against the NRA one time and got primaried almost out of existence. He had to retire because people started smashing his windows in. One vote. That's Michigan. It's not Texas. That's not Wyoming. That's not Alaska. That's a Midwestern Rust Belt state. It's in the blue wall of orbit. They haven't elected a Republican since, Donald Trump, and before that, Ronald Reagan. Okay. It's a losing issue. A lot of Democrats learned that, by the way, in 2000. And that's why they didn't really, we didn't get much gun control at the federal level, almost none legally. You had some executive orders here and there that meant nothing, and you're having some tweakings. The ATF is pissing off a lot of people. They've revoked licenses. Revocations have been up 5 times since Biden's been elected. 5 times. Oh, paperwork's wrong. License gone. Paperwork's gone. License gone. And they're changing it so that and to go back to the point that I tangentially lost, they made an exception if you did a private sale. Okay, yeah, that's the compromise. And then what, 5 years later? Well, that's a loophole. There needs to be a background check for everybody. That'll fix the problem. No evidence, by the way, that they do anything to crime. There are states that do that. And nobody can prove that it's reduced homicides by one person. Same thing, Canada passed a long gun registry. They said it would pay for itself and that it would solve crimes. It hasn't solved one crime. And it's cost, hundreds of millions of dollars. But they still go for it. There's an intractable minority. I'm not resting on my laurels. I smell blood. The way that some of these people talk, it's very clear what they want, and they'll do anything to get it. But What they don't know is that they're vastly outnumbered. And their rhetoric has a hard time in daylight. So you'll take your wins when you get them. The abortion win was a good win for federalism and for morality too, as far as I'm concerned. People differ on that. But this was, I would say, just as momentous. And there's been a revolution at the state level on this, but there's a couple states that, they have a couple urban centers that just rule. It doesn't matter if all of upstate New York wants something. If New York City wants it, New York City gets it. Okay, same with Illinois and Chicago. California, it's a little bit more mixed. California has 10 million gun owners. 10 million. It has more gun owners than there are people in Massachusetts, just about, or Michigan or Ohio. But there's 20 million other people in California, so, good luck. But all those middle states that Wanda Sykes hates so much, they have influence in the federal government, and there's many, many more of them. And they've been successful in getting judges in and getting laws not to be passed. And when the Republicans take the House, this is an easy win for them. It gives the Democrats nothing. Not politically, anyway. Ideologically, it's their bread and butter, right? You want a monopoly of force. You want a Leviathan. You can't have a Leviathan that's outgunned and outnumbered. So they don't like it, but it's not something they can really do anything about. So I was very pleased. When I heard the news, I went and congratulated the 18-year-old gun-toting New Yorker. I don't know if it's going to change tomorrow, in a week, in a month, but kicking and screaming, as long as there's federal supremacy, this is what's going to happen. Now, that's a mixed bag. I would much rather have a decentralized system. Much rather. I'd rather have there be 50 independent states than one. United by nothing at all would be better. Or if by something, a lattice work of minimal structure, with more like what the EU is supposed to be, but isn't. So, yeah. All right. 52-minute rant over. What do people have to say? Mr. Live Videos. Thanks, Alexandros. I don't make too many of them. Length, did you hear about the Chevron ruling? It may allow for others to challenge the ATF interpreting gun laws. It's my understanding this is going to change how almost all gun laws are interpreted. This is going to go back down to the district courts, and a lot's going to happen. The economy does not operate on rational principles. I don't know what you will get. Is there more to this that I can't see? No. Stop watching Fox News. I hope that's a joke. New York has banned arms in all parks, even ones in rural parks. California wants to ban guns in businesses unless the business explicitly has a sign saying carry is welcome, in addition to banks, transit parks. Yeah, I was reading people saying, oh, yeah, but then they'll say you can't have a gun within 1,000 feet of a school or 1,000 feet of a post office or 1,000 feet. In New York City, that just eliminates the whole thing. But Justice Thomas said explicitly, all of Manhattan can't be a gun-free zone. It's a joke. You can play that game. You're nullifying it. You're nullifying a right by doing that. So it's not right. It's wrong. You can't do that. Sorry. You can't do that you can't just declare free speech zones around every public building that extends out to the next public building. Right? You can't just abolish the Fourth Amendment and call it stop and frisk. I'm not just jealous at all, Alexandros. I don't eat watermelon. So, I don't know exactly the genesis of how. The NRA has been around forever, but they kind of became more political more recently. But there seemed to have been a push in the 90s, especially after Columbine, and people organized and they got out there and they put out the videos of the guns getting destroyed and all the stuff about the Holocaust, which is all completely pertinent. Right? Stephen Hallberg has a great book, Gun Control in the Third Reich. Read it. And I'm not one of those Rambo people who thinks, oh man, Civil War would be great. be awesome. I'd love it. Bring it on. Nope, I don't want that at all. That would be awful. It would be awful for everybody. And depending on the circumstances, it could be won or lost. I think people have to acknowledge the various different scenarios would have very different outcomes. Just goes without saying. But at some level, even if it was futile, I don't care. Right? If you're being put on the train to the camp, I don't care if your shotgun's not going to win the battle. It's better to go out that way than like a fucking animal, to just go off like a sheep to slaughter. But I also think that if everyone in that train, if you had a ghetto and everyone there was armed with shotguns, I don't think it would be so easy as if they had nothing at all. And if instead of shotguns they had rifles, even more. And it is weird, the rhetoric that these gun grabbers have. On the one hand, these are weapons of war that are too powerful to be allowed civilians to have. But on the other hand, they're completely impotent and have no effect in a revolution. Really? Pick one. Be consistent. I know it's difficult. It's a lot to ask, but pick one. So yeah, if we have a scenario where there's 100 people in rural Nevada who try and lead a revolution, yes, the fact that all of them have AR-15s is not going to matter. But if 50 million people resist, well, what are they going to do? Nuke the cities? What are they going to do? Right now, what scenario would it take for that to happen? Yeah, it's a good question. And I'm not laying odds on how likely or unlikely that is. But I don't care if there's no chance. That's better than just dying or just being a slave. And the first gun laws in this country were for slaves and Native Americans. Right? So you're in bad company if that's what your goal is. Ironically, bad company in most cases. So, yeah. Who's winning, leftists or ANCAPs? It depends on the battlefield. Leftists have definitely had their way for a century or more. ANCAPs haven't even existed for that long. So, yeah. All right, any final questions before I go? It's almost been an hour. Can you guys even hear me? All right. Well, thank you all very much.